Good afternoon, Glacier Hills. I'm very excited to be able to share with you one of my favorite things, stories by Paul Harvey. There's something relaxing about having somebody read a story to you. The good for nothing. When you're a little boy and Dad calls you good for nothing, it's just gotta hurt. That's just what Giuseppe's papa called him, good for nothing. Little Giuseppe was good for nothing. And he wasn't joking, for Papa came from a family of fishermen. 300 years the men in his family had been fishermen in Sicily, and Papa himself was a fisherman. When he first came to America, he worked on the railroad until he'd saved enough money to send for his wife. Then he headed straight for San Francisco to Fisherman's Wharf to become a fisherman again, to perpetuate the family's tradition. Eventually, Papa and Mama had 9 children, and you can imagine that all of the boys got their sea legs early. Began helping Papa out on his fishing boat from the time they learned to walk. All of them, that is, except Giuseppe. Giuseppe didn't want to. "What do you mean you don't want to?" demanded Papa. Giuseppe explained that the rocking of the small boat and the smell of the fish made him ill. It wasn't that he didn't want to help out. Fish just didn't agree with him, that's all. That wasn't good enough for Papa. As far as Papa was concerned, Giuseppe was a good for nothing. The boy had come from a long line of fishermen, and there was no reason in the world for the profession to disagree with him. Giuseppe was never too sick to go out and play with his friends. Why then did it make him sick to help his Papa? Not why, but what happened then is the rest of the story. Disturbed by his father's criticism, young Giuseppe tried very hard to adapt to the family business. The rocking of the boat and the smell of the fish still bothered him, so he turned to other tasks, such as sealing the boat and repairing the nets. But as hard as he tried to remain unaffected, the fish smell was still in the gear and made his already sensitive stomach even more queasy. Giuseppe quit. He went out and odd-jobbed wherever he could. Errand boy, newspaper boy. Sometimes he even pulled down $1 a day. It wasn't pocket money, it was table money. Every cent Giuseppe earned, he turned over to the household for food and clothing. You'd think Papa would be proud of his son, but to Papa, young Giuseppe was just being lazy. Odd jobs were lazy jobs, according to him. Real work was helping Papa on the fishing boat. This weighed pretty heavily on the lad. He started hiding under the bed when Papa came looking for him, or he ran off to play sports with his friends when he knew Papa was about to call him to the fishing boat. Tennis was especially interesting to him, watching the older boys play. He knew that tennis champs Maurice McLaughlin and Bill Johnston came from San Francisco, and he wanted to be like them. But the tennis passion didn't last long, and for the first time, Giuseppe began to believe his dad. Perhaps he was a lazy good-for-nothing who wouldn't even stay interested in a sport. Maybe he never would amount to anything. That's the way Giuseppe saw it back then. Everything just seemed sort of gloomy, hopeless. But as it turned out, Giuseppe one day became the most successful member of his family. Oh, he didn't go back to fishing. Despite his ancestry, Giuseppe just wasn't cut out to be a fisherman, or a tennis player for that matter. When Giuseppe finally found something that interested him sufficiently to stay with it, his passion for it was so great that 2 of his brothers quit fishing and joined him. You've heard of Giuseppe by his American first name. Everyone else has, I guess, and that great big world beyond Fisherman's Wharf won't forget the fishermen they lost. Neither will they forget the boy who forgot about tennis only to enter the world of sports and turn it upside down. For if that young man hadn't been too seasick to join the family business, he would have left a vacancy in baseball's Hall of Fame too great to fill. Giuseppe Joe DiMaggio. And now you know the rest of the story. Now it's time for another story. This one is entitled The Reluctant Vampire. Actor George Reeves put a gun to his head, pulled the trigger, now he's dead. But the bullet couldn't have been lead. Perhaps it was kryptonite. You see, George Reeves was Superman. Really was Superman to millions of TV viewers and for what must have seemed like a million of years to George. If he'd merely acted the part, if George had been an actor who'd taken the role for a day or the run of a play, perhaps the sad story of Superman would have ended differently. Instead, the Man of Steel scrawled a trembling farewell, explaining that there was no work for him outside that fabled phone booth. Then he took a revolver and vanquished the hero no villain could vanquish. But the question remains, did George jump the gun? Was he too quick on the trigger during a solitary hour of melancholy? It's true that his typecast popularity precluded a preponderance of diverse roles. This isn't meant to demean, but if George had been a truly versatile actor, wouldn't his day have come? Would the world have been forced to forget the comic book character from Krypton? We won't seek to answer that question here, but there's another story about another actor that might help you decide. His name was DeForest. DeForest was born into posh New York society almost 80 years ago. His father declared that his son would go to Yale, but failing grades and misconduct prevented the dream. Once expelled from school, 18-year-old DeForest joined the Navy. But it didn't change his luck. Smashed in the mouth and badly injured by an escaping prisoner, 3 days solitary on bread and water for an accidental AWOL, he turned to the civilian job market as all that was left. But that didn't work out either. He was no good at the National Biscuit Company. He was no good as a tugboat inspector. Eventually, he stumbled into the job he would keep for the rest of his life, acting. And DeForest was a good actor, perhaps even a great one. That's what made the difference. A decade would bring him to Hollywood. Then, through another decade, a string of uneven movie roles. One such role was in a picture called The Return of Dr. X, a vampire movie. And DeForest made a terribly convincing vampire. Audiences cringed at the hollow eyes, the sallow complexion, the bared fangs. Perhaps at last DeForest had found his niche in life. After all, he was perfect for the part. And some movie makers had given up on him as a strong lead, because that injury dealt him by an escaping prisoner during his Navy years had left him with a speech impediment. A less gifted actor would have stopped there, as a vampire. For DeForest, it was only the beginning. He took those 10 years of fractured movie roles and turned them into triumph. The next 17 years, which might have been spent as a reluctant vampire, bore his own authentic stamp instead. For the lisp from a smashed lip had then become a trademark. A lesser thespian might have been nailed by a typecast stake of holly. But this creature of All Through the Night flew the crypt. He traded the bat for the Maltese falcon, and while others played out, he played it against Humphrey DeForest Bogart. And now you know the rest of the story. And here we have another story, this one entitled Futility. Best-selling books, big box office, and bombshell television specials are hitting us over the head with a new club, Fact. The once popular strictly fiction format is gradually yielding to history, phasing out in favor of truth. Example, Roots. ABC's 12-hour surefire winner. It held you because it happened. Here's another novel of historical significance, Futility. That's the name of the book, Futility. And you say you've not heard of it? You'll wonder why you haven't when I tell you the rest of the story. The novel Futility is about the maiden voyage of a fabulous ocean liner, a ship far larger than any previously built, labeled unsinkable. The vessel sets sail for New York from Southampton with a cargo of complacent passengers, strikes an iceberg en route, and goes down. And the ship was called the Titan. So why didn't author Morgan Robertson come right out and say it? His Titan is obviously the Titanic. Both liners were touted as the biggest, the grandest, the most luxurious, and foolproof. Both struck icebergs on their maiden voyages between Southampton and New York. Both were inadequately stocked with lifeboats, resulting in heavy casualties. And both sank at exactly the same spot in the North Atlantic, each on a cold April night. It would seem clear that the real-life ship Titanic is the setting for the novel Futility. So why would the author have allowed for such minor discrepancies as these? The Titanic, the real liner, displaced 66,000 tons. Robert's vessel, the Titan, displaced 70,000 tons. The Titanic was 882 and 1/2 feet long. Robertson rounded off his ship to 800 feet in length. Even the apparent abbreviation of the name Titanic to Titan seems hardly worth the use of literary license. After all, both liners were triple screw, could travel up to 25 knots, could carry up to 3,000 people. All of the specific similarities were there, and yet author Morgan Robertson did not call it history. Why? In the first place, Robertson's characters, the passengers aboard the Titan, were purely fictional. Their personal interactions, problems, fears were examined closely, and at last the ship sank, hence the novel's title, Futility. But there was another type of futility demonstrated in Robertson's book, a hopelessness that not even the author himself could have recognized. For the novel that so accurately described an authentic disaster in the Atlantic, the book that charted an invisible course through the water to an appointment with death, owned up to its title beyond the wildest dreams of its readers. For the literature that in every way seemed to recount, in reality foretold, in 1898, 14 years before the real-life Titanic set sail. And now you know the rest of the story. Our next story is entitled, Dr. Bell is Alive and Well. Everybody has a favorite teacher. Artie Doyle had a favorite teacher. Artie Doyle was a medical student. First year med school, he had a favorite teacher, a professor named Bell. Dr. Bell must have been a fascinating instructor because Artie remembered him all his life. In fact, that's how we know about Dr. Bell, from Artie. The thing that made Dr. Joseph Bell so interesting was the way he taught. It was so special that he kept students on the edge of their seats. Joseph Bell had started at the bottom as a hospital attendant and wound up head of the Edinburgh University Medical School. If you knew Dr. Bell, you'd say he made it because he knew how to think. That's what he was always telling his students. You've got to learn how to think, or all you'll know won't get you anywhere. Bell used to demonstrate this to his students. He had an outpatient facility where he interviewed patients, and sometimes he would invite his class to join him there. He'd have them stand around and watch while these new patients came in to see the doctor. The stories make Bell sound a lot like Dr. Gillespie, squinting over his glasses and intimidating his patients with a childishly wicked expression. Then he'd say something like, "Oh, you must either be a cork cutter or a slatter." The startled patient would acknowledge that he was, in fact, a slater. Dr. Bell would then turn to his class and wink. He had observed a slight callus on one side of the forefinger and a little thickening on the outside of the thumb. For observant Bell, that was enough to identify the trait of his patient. Another time, Dr. Bell turned to his class immediately before interviewing a patient. "This man's a cobbler," he told them. And he was right. Bell had caught a glimpse of the man's trousers. They were worn at the inside of the knee, right where the cobbler's lapstone sits. Now, you say this doesn't sound much like medicine, but what Dr. Bell was trying to impress upon his students, what he was trying to cultivate in them, was the power of observation. You must notice everything, he told them. A good doctor has to notice everything. Still another time, Dr. Bell told a brand new patient that he, the patient, was not long discharged from the Army. Bell had no readily obvious way of knowing this. The man was wearing street clothes. But Dr. Bell went on to say that the patient had been a non-com officer in a Highland regiment and that he had been stationed at Barbados. Dr. Bell was right on all accounts. It was very simple, he explained to his students. The man was respectful, but did not remove his hat. They do not in the Army, but he would have learned civilian ways had he been long discharged. He had an air of authority, was obviously Scottish. As to Barbados, his complaint was elephantitis, which is West Indian and not British. And to Dr. Bell's students, something else was obvious, that for Dr. Bell, medicine was sort of, detective work. It's not a matter of coincidence that complicated mystery stories also fascinated him. So it was the way he thought and the way he taught that kept his students spellbound. I'm thinking, however, about Artie Doyle, the first-year med student who sat enraptured in the back of Bell's class. Artie would go on to become a doctor, yet you will know him better for another talent. Artie also became a writer. And though the medicine he learned from Dr. Bell was significant, his professor's power of inductive reasoning was even more so. Artie immortalized it, and him in a character the world can never forget, because Artie one day became Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And because one classmate remembered him so well, Dr. Bell is even yet alive and well, 100 years later, and living in literary history forever as the greatest ever criminal diagnostician. It was Dr. Bell who was the author's model for the master sleuth of all time, Sherlock Holmes. And now you know the rest of the story. And here's for another story, this one entitled Madness in the Air. Two couples went out for the evening, in much the same way couples everywhere do. There was dinner, and a show, and there was madness in the air. One couple was married, the other engaged. And while the marriage of the first was not without turmoil, the union of the second was most promising indeed, until madness struck. It's been suggested that when the insane were locked away in days gone by, it was because the so-called sane feared the contagion of insanity. In other words, many believed madness to be catching, like a disease. In an effort to immunize themselves, they packed off the crazies to faraway places, believing they might avoid thereby the inflictions of the mad. Of course, this isolation of the insane was insane. And while there are some communicable diseases that manifest unusual behavior in the victim, and while we have traced some forms of insanity such as schizophrenia to blood disorders and vitamin deficiencies, there is no modern-day evidence that madness as such can be caught like a cold. Almost no evidence. For occasionally, the precepts of medieval medicine and Dark Ages psychiatry comes back to haunt us. Once upon a time, two couples went out for the evening, in much the same way couples everywhere do. And there is a rest of the story. There was dinner, and a show, and perhaps even madness in the air. How else could what happened to them have happened to them? Let's take the four, one at a time. A distant relative of actor Basil Rathbone, Major Henry Rathbone, intelligent, honest, a good Army officer. As far as we know, any predisposition to violence he might have had began and ended with the military. Major Henry's companion for the evening was his fiancée, Clara Harris. An attractive gentlewoman, she one day married the Major, despite what happened that night. Third in the party was Mary. High-spirited, quick-witted, well-educated, Mary came from a rather distinguished family. Some of her relatives frowned on the man she had married, who accompanied her that evening. and even he from time to time doubted that any man could make Mary happy. Nevertheless, they'd been engaged, broken it off, become engaged again, and finally married. They had 4 children, only one of whom survived to adulthood. And though Mary and her husband seemed truly to love each other, their marriage was often beset by hectic quarrels and perhaps unfounded jealousies. Then one day, the scales, already precariously balanced, began to tip. Mary started to suffer from recurring headaches, fits of temper, and a sense of insecurity and loneliness that was intensified by her husband's long absences on the lawyer's circuit. Although this is not meant to suggest that the creeping madness that began the night began with Mary, she was later adjudged certified insane. For, once upon a time, 2 couples went out together. There must have been madness in the air. Major Henry eventually married Clara, and shortly thereafter, in a fit of inexplicable rage, murdered her. And on the very evening the 4 shared each other's company, Mary's husband was killed in cold blood by a man decidedly insane. And that man, days later, was gunned down by another who also went mad. If the chain remains unbroken, what you've heard is all we know. And if there was madness in the air that night, perhaps it lingers still. For 2 couples went out together that night in Washington, D.C. in 1865. There was dinner and a show at Ford's Theater. And now you know the rest of the story. And now it's time for another story, this one entitled The Violinist Who Nearly Became President of Israel. Christmas Eve in Princeton, New Jersey, usually fulfills the picture postcard promise of Christmas. And it was so on that one particular Christmas Eve long ago. Church bells pealed in the distance. A light snowfall kissed the quaint Princeton houses, and door to door carol singers made their way to one particular home. The violinist's home, the gentle violinist. "O little town of Bethlehem," the boys sang, "how still we see thee lie." In moments the door opened, and the gentle old violinist stood in the doorway to greet the carolers. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by. The musician turned away, turned back into the house. Shortly he reappeared with his violin. There he completed a picture too intimate for a postcard, a sound too inspiring for any but this story. The great man, the gentle old musician, accompanied the midnight carolers on his beloved instrument through each verse of the age-old hymn. Then, without a word to break the spell, the young people turned away silently, and the old man slowly closed the door. At once there was only the distant pealing of the bells and the snowfall. And if this true story, this real-life scene from a year-long past, if it is made more wonderful, it is not because a seasoned violin was brought out of retirement for one last spontaneous recital, but because the violinist himself had the best reason of all not to celebrate that snowy Christmas scene. The great genius was a Jew, and so revered was he that the very presidency of Israel once could have been his. But here is the rest of the story. Musicians will tell you every great genius was his idol. This violinist's idol was Mozart. In his own words, the musician described the turning point in his early musical career. I really began to learn only when I was about 13 years old, mainly after I had fallen in love with Mozart's sonatas. The attempt to reproduce their singular grace compelled me to improve my technique. I believe, on the whole, that love is a better teacher than sense of duty. With me, at least, it certainly was. Once, a friend asked the violinist to comment on modern times. When the musician was a boy, wars were fought with rifles and cannons. Now the entire world might be devastated. What did that mean to the old man? The violinist hesitated, sat back thoughtfully in his chair. It would mean, he said at last, that people would no longer hear Mozart. For him, this most deeply conveyed the end of civilization. On many an occasion, he would break an hours-long chamber music session with the same observation. Mozart's music was so pure that it seemed to have been ever present in the universe, waiting to be discovered by the master. So the great genius had an idol, and that idol was Mozart. For him, Mozart was what the world was all about. And when this violinist was offered the highest Jewish honor, the presidency of Israel, he declined, saying that he felt unqualified for a role that involved human relations. Yet, who could have felt human warmth more deeply than the musician who had worshipped Mozart, than the old Jewish gentleman who serenaded Christian carolers from his last home? For him, Mozart was not a composer, but a discoverer of celestial music that lay waiting in the universe. So when the violinist began to explore the universe, those closest to him believed that he was merely searching for what Mozart had found. More logically, this musician's idol might well have been Sir Isaac Newton, but he counted himself first as a violinist. For the musician who worshipped Mozart, the revered genius who could have been president of Israel, was the man who literally altered the meaning of infinity, hoping to discover music. He was Dr. Albert Einstein. And now you know the rest of the story.